On a cold morning in March 1964, a 9-year-old girl walked to school in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. She never made it, no witnesses who saw exactly what happened, no clear suspect, no immediate answers, just a child who left home on a familiar route and vanished before reaching the classroom. By nightfall, the search ended in the worst possible way. And then something even more unsettling happened. The case went silent. For years, then decades, then generations. Detectives retired, witnesses aged, leads disappeared, until science caught up with time itself. Nearly 60 years later, investigators made an announcement that stunned even seasoned cold case detectives. They had finally found the person responsible. But here's the question that still lingers. How does a case go from a quiet school morning in 1964 to a breakthrough in modern DNA technology without anyone seeing the truth in between? And what really happened in those missing hours no one could explain. This is the story of Marise Ann Chiverella and the cold case that refused to stay buried. Before we dive deeper into the story, tell me where you are watching from, and kindly consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps us continue producing in-depth crime. Documentaries like this one, stories that not only seek answers for victims and their families, but also raise awareness about the circumstances surrounding these crimes. Your support helps this channel grow and continue its mission of using knowledge, awareness, and education as tools in the fight against crime. Now, let's get to the details of this story. There are mornings that feel ordinary, right up until the moment they aren't. In March 18, 1964, a neighborhood in Hazleton, Pennsylvania began like any other weekday in a quiet industrial town shaped by coal dust, early shifts, and familiar routines. Children walked to school in groups. Parents prepared for work. Teachers opened classroom doors expecting a normal day of lessons. Nothing about that morning suggested it would become one of the longest unresolved mysteries in American law enforcement history. But sometimes, the most ordinary moments carry the most irreversible consequences. And on this day, one small routine walk would disappear into silence for nearly 6 decades. Marise Ann Chiverella was 9 years old. She lived in Hazleton with her family in a tightly connected working-class neighborhood, where most people knew each other by name, and doors were often left unlocked without fear. She was not a child surrounded by chaos or instability. Her life, by every account from those who knew her, was structured, predictable, and safe in the way small-town America often assumes safety to be guaranteed. Each morning followed the same rhythm: home, school, church, family. And on this particular morning, she followed that rhythm, just as she always had. Before leaving home, Marise prepared for school in a way that seemed almost routine to anyone watching from the outside. She carried herself with the quiet discipline of a child who took school seriously. She even brought small items meant for her teacher that day, an ordinary gesture, the kind that would normally be forgotten by evening. But she never reached the classroom. Not that morning, not ever again. At approximately early morning hours, Marise left her home and began walking towards St. Joseph's Parochial School, a route she had taken countless times before. There was nothing unusual reported, no signs of distress, no known concern from neighbors, no indication that anything was wrong. In fact, everything appeared exactly as it should be, and that is what makes what happened next so difficult to reconcile. Because in cases like this, danger rarely announces itself. It blends into routine. It hides inside familiarity. For a brief window of time, Marise was simply a child walking to school in a town that felt safe enough not to question that walk. But somewhere along that path, something interrupted that normality. Something that would never be fully witnessed in real time. Something that would only be reconstructed decades later through fragments of evidence, memory gaps, and forensic science that did not yet exist in 1964. By the time school began to notice her absence, confusion started to form. At first, it was small, a missing student, perhaps delayed, perhaps stopped along the way. But as minutes turned into hours, that explanation began to collapse. Because Marise was not late, she was gone. And in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, the realization that a 9-year-old child had disappeared during a routine school morning, would trigger something the town had never experienced at this scale before. A full search effort without any direction, no known suspect, no confirmed timeline beyond her last known sighting, no technology to retrace her steps, only questions and a growing sense of urgency that something irreversible had already occurred. What investigators did not know at that moment was that this case would not resolve quickly. It would not resolve in weeks, or months, or even years. It would stretch across generations, long enough for the world around it to change completely, long enough for science itself to evolve into something capable of answering questions that 1964 investigators could not even ask. But on that day, none of that future existed yet. Only a missing child, a normal morning that no longer made sense, and a community beginning to realize that the routine they trusted had just been broken in a way they could not undo. And somewhere outside that early morning calm, Marise Ann Chiverella had already vanished from sight. But what happened to her in those missing hours would remain one of Pennsylvania's most enduring mysteries, until the truth finally caught up. When a case goes cold for decades, investigators are often left with something far more frustrating than silence. They are left with fragments, a few verified facts, a handful of witness memories, and long gaps where truth should exist, but does not. For Marise Ann Chiverella, the early investigation began with exactly that problem. Not too little information, but not enough to form a complete picture of what happened during the most critical minutes of her disappearance. What was known, however, was simple and deeply unsettling. A 9-year-old girl had left home on a normal school morning. She was last seen walking towards St. Joseph's parochial school in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, and somewhere along that short, familiar route, she vanished from public sight. No confirmed struggle witnessed. No verified interruption reported at the exact moment of disappearance. No immediate clue pointing investigators in a clear direction. Mauridi. Just a gap in time, a gap that would define the entire case. In early stages of the investigation, law enforcement began reconstructing Marise's route step by step. They retraced the streets she would have walked. They spoke to local residents. They attempted to identify anyone who might have seen something unusual that morning. But Hazleton, in 1964, was not a city covered in surveillance or recorded movement. There were no cameras, no digital footprints, no automated tracking systems. Everything depended on human memory. And human memory, especially under shock or time pressure, is fragile. One of the most difficult realities investigators faced was that nothing about that morning stood out at first glance. The neighborhood was active, but not chaotic. People were going about their routines. Children were moving between home and school as they always did. It was the kind of environment where small anomalies can easily go unnoticed. And that created a dangerous investigative condition. If something happened, it likely happened without being widely observed. As the hours passed and Marise did not arrive at school, concern escalated into urgency. Teachers alerted authorities. Family members began searching nearby areas. Community members joined in, without formal coordination. What began as a simple missing child report quickly transformed into a town-wide search effort. But there was a critical limitation. No one knew where to search first, because no one could confirm where the routine ended and something else began. Investigators eventually focused on narrowing the timeline. They needed to determine the last possible moment Marise was seen alive and well. That moment became the anchor point of the entire case. But even that anchor was weak. Witness accounts were inconsistent in detail, not because of negligence, but because everyday mornings rarely leave strong mental impressions unless something unusual occurs. And according to early reports, nothing unusual was clearly recorded. This is where cold cases often begin to fracture. When there is no definitive interruption point, the investigation becomes a widening circle of uncertainty. The question stops being, what happened, and becomes, where did we lose sight of her? At some point during that morning route, something changed the direction of Marise's life, permanently. But in 1964, investigators had no scientific tools capable of reconstructing that moment with precision. No DNA leads, no digital geolocation, no forensic timeline, reconstruction techniques available today. Only physical searching, and hope that someone, somewhere, remembered something they had not yet realized was important. As daylight turned into afternoon, the search expanded beyond the school route. Nearby wooded areas were checked, roads were surveyed, local, industrial zones were examined. But each passing hour reduced the chance of a quick resolution. Because in missing child cases, time is not neutral. Time actively works against recovery. And by the time the search reached full intensity, investigators were already confronting a troubling possibility: that Marise had not simply wandered off course, that her disappearance may have involved intentional human action. But without evidence, that remained only a theory, not a conclusion. What made the case especially difficult at this stage was the absence of a clear suspect profile. No confirmed suspect, no reliable description of a potential offender. No eyewitness account that could anchor the investigation toward a specific individual. Just a child who left home on a normal morning and never arrived at school. And as investigators expanded their search outward, one critical question began to form quietly in the background. A question that would remain unanswered for decades. If Marise did not simply disappear on her own, then who was the last person to see her before she vanished completely? Because somewhere in that short walk to school, the story of Marise Ann Chiverella stopped being routine and became something far more permanent. In most missing child cases, there is a moment investigators hope for above all others. A moment of confusion turning into clarity. A moment where uncertainty collapses into direction. But in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, on March 18, 1964, that moment arrived in the worst possible way. Not as a rescue, not as a safe return, but as a discovery that immediately transformed a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. Marise Ann Chiverella was found the same day she disappeared. The search that had begun as a community effort was still unfolding when the worst fears of investigators were confirmed. She was located in a remote, isolated area outside the normal flow of daily activity, an industrial dumping zone associated with coal refuse, a place not meant for routine travel, and not likely to be reached by accident. The discovery changed the entire investigative posture instantly. What had been a missing child case was now a criminal investigation. Every available officer, every available resource, and every local lead shifted focus toward one central objective: understanding how she ended up there, and who was responsible. But even at this early stage, investigators faced a severe limitation. The environment itself offered very little usable evidence by modern standards. This was 1964. Forensic science was still developing. Crime scene protocols were far less standardized than they are today. And the tools that modern investigators rely on, DNA sequencing, trace biological analysis at scale, digital reconstruction, did not exist. What investigators had instead was physical observation, the condition of the scene, the geography of the location, the absence of clear witnesses, and a growing awareness that whoever was responsible had likely acted with awareness of isolation, because the location itself suggested intentional concealment, not visibility, not exposure, but distance from normal observation. Law enforcement immediately began expanding the investigation outward from the discovery site. They retraced Marise's last known walking route. They canvassed nearby neighborhoods again, this time with urgency intensified by the discovery. They asked residents a more difficult question. Not whether they had seen her walking to school, but whether they had seen anything unusual during the early morning hours. Anything at all. But Hazleton was a town where daily life moved quietly. People were accustomed to routine movement. Workers heading to shifts, children walking to school, cars passing through familiar streets. And in environments like this, unusual events can occur without being recognized as unusual in the moment. A passing figure, a brief interaction, a moment seen but not fully registered. All of it becomes difficult to retrieve after the fact. As investigators pieced together the timeline, a troubling gap emerged. They could identify when Marise left home. They could confirm she was last seen en route to school. But between those 2 points and the eventual discovery, there was a complete absence of verified detail. That gap would become the central mystery of the entire case. At the time, investigators also began forming early theories. One possibility was that Marise encountered someone during her walk. Another was that she may have been approached in a moment where she was alone and away from public view. But none of these theories could be confirmed without evidence. And evidence, in this case, was limited and fragile. What made the investigation especially difficult was the lack of surveillance infrastructure. There were no cameras to review, no traffic systems to trace movement, no electronic records of presence or absence. Every conclusion had to be built from human testimony and physical terrain, and both were incomplete. As word spread through the community, the emotional weight of the discovery began to settle in. Hazleton was not a large city. It was a close-knit environment where news traveled quickly and personally. The discovery of a child in such circumstances created a ripple of shock that affected families, schools, and neighborhoods simultaneously. But even in the midst of that shock, one question began to dominate investigative thinking. How long had she been there before she was found? Because the answer to that question could define the entire sequence of events. And yet, at the time, it remained unknowable. The discovery of Marise Ann Chiverella closed one door in the investigation, but it opened another far more complex one. A door leading into decades of unanswered questions. A door that would remain open long after the initial investigation lost momentum. And a case that, for nearly 60 years, would refuse to reveal the identity of the person responsible. Because from that moment onward, the question was no longer where she was. It was who had taken the time to make sure she would not be found in time. In the hours and days following the discovery, Hazleton's law enforcement faced a reality that is often invisible to the public eye. A case can be urgent, active, and intensely investigated, yet still produce no immediate answers. And when that happens, momentum begins to collide with limitation. That is exactly what unfolded in the Marise Ann Chiverella investigation. At first, the response was comprehensive for its time. Local officers canvassed neighborhoods. Detectives interviewed residents along school routes. Search teams rechecked areas surrounding the discovery site. And investigators attempted to reconstruct the timeline in reverse, starting from the location where Marise was found and working backward toward her final known movements. But every path they followed eventually led to the same outcome: a dead end without continuity. One of the core challenges in 1964 was the absence of forensic precision tools that modern investigators rely on. There was no DNA profiling, no computerized databases, no cross-jurisdictional suspect matching systems. Investigators depended heavily on witness recollection, physical observation, manual record, comparison, and investigative intuition. Each of these tools has value, but none are absolute. And when a case lacks strong eyewitness continuity, even the best efforts can stall. As initial urgency faded, investigators attempted to identify potential suspects within the local area. This involved speaking with individuals who lived or worked near Marise's route to school. However, without a clear description or confirmed suspect behavior pattern, the scope of inquiry remained broad, and broad investigations often struggle with focus. Because when everyone is a possibility, no one stands out. Another major limitation was the absence of consistent trace evidence analysis methods that exist today. Modern forensic science can extract microscopic details from environments that were once considered uninformative. But in the 1960s, investigative interpretation relied on visible, measurable, and accessible evidence. If something could not be clearly observed or tested with available tools, it often could not be used to build a prosecutable case. Over time, the case began to experience a common pattern seen in mid-20th century investigations. Active pursuit gradually slowed. Leads were revisited periodically, but became less productive. New investigative priorities emerged for law enforcement agencies, and the case, while never fully closed in intent, began to transition into what is known in policing as a cold file. A case not forgotten, but no longer advancing. For Marise's family, however, there was no such transition. For them, the case did not become cold. It remained unresolved, a permanent absence without explanation, a question that did not diminish with time, only deepened. As years turned into decades, the investigative file continued to exist in archives. It was reviewed occasionally as technology evolved, but without immediate breakthroughs, it remained static. The passage of time introduced a new challenge: evidence degradation and loss of contextual memory. Witnesses aged, some moved away, others passed on, and the environment that once surrounded the case physically changed. But even in silence, one critical decision preserved the possibility of future resolution. Certain physical evidence collected in 1964 was retained. At the time, there was no guarantee it would ever become useful again, but that preservation would later become the single most important factor in solving the case. By the late 20th century and early 21st century, forensic science had begun to evolve in ways that early investigators could not have anticipated. DNA profiling became a standard investigative tool. Databases expanded nationally, and eventually, genetic genealogy emerged as a method capable of tracing familial connections across generations. But none of that progress could be applied retroactively unless evidence still existed. And in this case, it did. What had once been an unsolved case, buried in paper files, was now entering a new phase of potential re-examination. Not because the past had changed, but because science finally had the ability to ask questions that were once impossible. And somewhere inside that archived evidence was a trace that had waited nearly 60 years to be understood. A trace that would eventually connect Hazleton's quiet morning in 1964 to a name that had never fully disappeared from the community, but had never been proven responsible until now. For nearly 6 decades, the case of Marise Ann Chiverella remained unchanged in one critical way. There was no confirmed identity of the person responsible, no courtroom resolution, no conviction, no definitive answer, just an archived file waiting for science to catch up with it. And when that moment finally arrived, it did not come through eyewitness memory, it came through biology. By the early 2000s, forensic science had reached a turning point. DNA analysis, once limited in scope and resolution, had become powerful enough to identify individuals with extraordinary accuracy. But even more transformative was what came next: genetic genealogy. A method that does not simply compare suspects, but reconstructs family relationships across generations using shared DNA patterns. In 2007, investigators working on the Marise Chiverella case revisited preserved evidence collected from the original 1964 investigation. At the time of collection, no one could have predicted its future value, but it had been stored carefully enough to allow modern forensic testing. From that evidence, scientists were able to extract a viable DNA profile. That profile became the anchor point for everything that followed. For years, the DNA profile remained in national databases, waiting for a match. But there was no immediate direct hit, because the person responsible was not in the system. And this is where genetic genealogy changed everything. Instead of searching for a direct match, investigators began searching for relatives, distant connections, partial overlaps, family lines that could be reconstructed like a map. The process was slow and methodical. Investigators worked with genealogy specialists who built extensive family trees using DNA-linked relatives found in public and private databases. Each branch narrowed the field. Each generation reduced the number of possible identities. What began as a broad unknown gradually condensed into a focused set of individuals who fit both the genetic and historical timeline. Eventually, the investigation converged on a man who had lived in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, during the early 1960s. A man whose timeline placed him in proximity to the victim at the time of her disappearance. That man was identified as James Paul Forte. This identification did not come from assumption. It came from layered verification, genetic overlap through family lineage mapping, corroboration of historical residence records, and cross-referencing with preserved forensic evidence. Each layer reinforced the conclusion, but investigators still needed one final confirmation: DNA directly linked to preserved evidence from the original case. That confirmation was ultimately achieved. Forensic testing matched the genetic profile derived from evidence in the 1964 case to the family line identified through genealogy. The conclusion was no longer theoretical, it was evidential. However, one critical detail shaped the legal outcome of the case. James Paul Forte had died in 1980, meaning that by the time of identification, no arrest could be made, no interrogation could be conducted, and no criminal trial could occur. The justice system could not proceed in the traditional courtroom sense. Instead, the case reached a different kind of conclusion, a posthumous identification, a formal acknowledgement by law enforcement that the individual responsible had been identified beyond reasonable doubt through forensic evidence. Authorities publicly announced the resolution of the case, confirming the identity of the Hazleton suspect, the scientific basis for the conclusion and the closure of the investigation after nearly 58 years. It was one of the longest-running cold cases in Pennsylvania history to be solved through DNA genealogy. But even with resolution, one reality remained unchanged. Science had identified the truth, but time had already removed the possibility of legal consequence. For investigators, this type of conclusion carries a complex weight. There is satisfaction in solving the unknown, but also recognition that justice, in its traditional form, is sometimes bound by the limits of time itself. And for Hazleton, a quiet town that had lived with an unanswered question for nearly 2 generations, the name that emerged from the evidence finally replaced uncertainty with clarity. But clarity is not the same as closure. And the final chapter of this case would belong not to the courtroom, but to the family left behind. When a case lasts nearly 6 decades, its ending is never just about facts. It becomes about everything that was lived in between. The unanswered birthdays, the missing milestones, the silence that replaced a voice that should have grown into adulthood. And in the case of Marise Ann Chiverella, the resolution arrived in a form that modern justice systems increasingly recognize, but still struggle to emotionally reconcile. A solved case without a courtroom trial. With the identification of James Paul Forte confirmed through DNA and genetic genealogy, authorities officially closed the investigation. The evidence was considered scientifically conclusive, but because Forte had died in 1980, the legal system could not proceed in the traditional sense. No arrest was possible, no prosecution could be filed, and no judicial verdict could be issued by a jury. Instead, the case reached its final legal status as a posthumous forensic resolution, a conclusion defined not by sentencing, but by certainty. From an investigative standpoint, this type of resolution is rare, but increasingly significant in modern cold case work. It establishes 3 critical legal facts. The identity of the offender has been determined through validated scientific methods. The evidentiary standard is sufficient for official closure, and the evidentiary case is no longer considered open for active prosecution. In simpler terms, the question of who was finally answered. But the justice system could no longer ask what happens next. For Marise's family, the unidentified announcement carried a weight that cannot be measured in legal terminology. For nearly 58 years, they had lived with uncertainty, a permanent absence with no explanation, no confirmed narrative, no official resolution. Just time passing over a wound that never fully closed. When the identification was made public, the emotional response reflected a complicated truth often seen in long-delayed cases. There was relief in finally knowing what happened, relief in having a name attached to the unknown, relief in no longer searching for answers that may never come. But there was also something else, a recognition that time had already taken what justice traditionally depends on most, the ability to respond in real time. The family's experience can be understood through a simple but powerful contrast. Before the breakthrough, there was uncertainty, silence, and endless questioning. After the breakthrough, clarity, historical truth, and emotional resolution. But not legal closure. This duality is what defines most cold case resolutions in the modern era. For law enforcement, the case became a landmark example of what persistence and technology can achieve together. It demonstrated that evidence preservation is critical, scientific progress can outpace time and cases once considered permanently unsolved can still be resolved decades later. It also reinforced a broader shift in investigative policing. Cold cases are no longer static archives. They are active possibilities waiting for new methods. But for the public, the most important lesson from this case is not technological. It is behavioral. Because the original incident occurred during something deeply ordinary, a child walking a familiar route to school on a normal morning. No extraordinary circumstances, no obvious warning signs, just routine. And it is within routine that vulnerability often goes unnoticed. This is why cases like this are often used in public awareness discussions, not to create fear, but to reinforce awareness of environment, timing, and observation. Paying attention to unusual patterns in familiar spaces, recognizing that normal does not always mean safe, and understanding that awareness is a layer of protection, especially for children in transit. In the end, the case of Marise Ann Chiverella does not conclude like a courtroom drama. There is no judge announcing a sentence, no jury delivering a verdict, no final confrontation between guilt and punishment. Instead, there is something quieter, a truth finally recovered from a name identified, a timeline reconstructed, a mystery resolved, and a community that after nearly 60 years finally understands what happened on a single morning in 1964. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the case is not the resolution itself, is the reminder that even when time erases witnesses, memories, and physical traces, it does not always erase the truth. Sometimes it only delays it. And in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, a child who once disappeared on a school morning in 1964 is no longer a question mark in history. She is a confirmed story, a solved case, and a reminder that some answers, no matter how long they take, do eventually come back into the light. Thank you for watching. If you found value in this content and would like to get more eye-opening and in-depth analytical crime stories like this, kindly subscribe and turn on the notification. Here is another cold case that stood frozen in time for decades, until genetic genealogy technology finally solved it.